Hello, everyone, and good evening, and welcome to our Journey Through the Author Bank seminar with Dr. Shumaker from Colorado Christian University. I'm going to take a little bit of time just to let everyone trickle in. We are so glad that you are here. Get started in a little bit. But first, I think it's important to talk about why CLT is doing these seminars and webinars. So as many of you are probably aware, we have a fantastic author bank. And this author bank is a collection of writers and thinkers and philosophers and saints and statesmen who have influenced our greater Western tradition and written things that continue to impact us today. So we on the CLT, throughout all of our exams, draw about 2/3 of our writing passages from this author bank. And so it's a great way for y'all to gain familiarity with these authors and hear from a professor at one of our partner colleges to just learn more about what you'll be seeing on your tests. But more than that, these authors have continued to impact us in multiple ways. And so we encourage you to take a look at that author bank page on our website, and who knows, you might find your new favorite writer. So we're just gonna let some more people trickle in. Get started in a little bit. Right, well, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Shumaker. He is a professor of politics at Colorado Christian University, which is one of our fantastic partner schools. We highly recommend that you take a look at them. And I'm going to turn it over to him to go ahead and start giving us a talk on St. Augustine. So over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you. A real privilege here to speak. Yeah, so talking about Augustine, well, there's so much there. The easy, I guess, the most obvious thing to think about with Augustine is really as a theologian and as someone who cast a very, very, very long and I would say a very nice shadow for at least for 1,000 years through the Middle Ages. So we think about him in this historical context. He's living in the last half, born about midway through the 300s, and then he sees the fall of Rome, and he needs to be able to address that as the Christian faith and church is maligned as a result of the fall of Rome, and so forth. So we could spend a lot of time talking about that, the theological significance of Augustine. Some of the high points would be in terms of what's called soteriology. Soteriology is the formal theological doctrine of salvation and the question of the individual's ability to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, as it were, and to be able to successfully save themselves is a question that Augustine addresses, and he comes firmly down on the need of the individual for God's grace, and that humans aren't capable of saving themselves from their sin. So he's very influential with that. You might have heard of the word Pelagianism, semi-Pelagianism. These are some of the terms that frame the question of the extent to which we humans need God's grace and so forth. So he's an important player for that, for soteriology. Also, this has implications then for the theological doctrine of anthropology, which is, okay, from a biblical theological perspective, what is the nature of man? And you can see here that if man can't save himself, then that says something about man's nature. And so he's also very important for that. He also has written a work, De Trinitate, which is on the Trinity, in which he sees that the world as we know it, the human soul, has all kinds of imprints of this kind of Trinitarian structure to things. So if God is God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, this Trinitarian being, then we shouldn't be surprised to discover that the world around us and the way we are have lots and lots of Trinitarian kind of groups of threes structures to them. So he's significant for that, De Trinitate, on the Trinity. He's also very significant in terms of the relationship of reason to faith. And so one of the big debates in the Middle Ages is whether you have to know in order to believe, or whether you have to believe in order to know. And without getting into the weeds there, he's one that really establishes the position that you have to believe. You have to believe, and then in believing, then certain truths can be knowable. Right? So anyways, he's very influential in all these different ways. And maybe just one more here. With the role of the Bible becoming a source of authority, then a major question comes down to hermeneutics. That is, formally, how are you supposed to not translate, but interpret the Bible? And so he has an extensive account of how the Bible should be interpreted, very influential. And that's in his book on Christian doctrine. So this is just like a whirlwind tour to acknowledge the fact that Augustine has huge influence, especially just in terms of his theology. And that's really important to take note of that. That said, I'd like to move on from that and just kind of focus on two of his major works, The City of God, Civitate Dei, and then also his Confessions. And I would say that his Confessions probably, by far, probably read the most, known the most, although The City of God, I mean, it's a tome, it's huge. So it's pretty intimidating, but it's also significant and widely respected. So I want to kind of focus on those two books. And from this perspective, I want to talk about not so much Augustine as someone who casts this large influence, certainly for the next 1,000 years, and then especially through the Protestant Reformation, to the present and these theological issues, but really try to think of him as a kind of bridge figure, a transitional figure. And it's always fun. I'm not a historian. I'm a politics guy and great books guy. I love working through maybe the history of ideas more so than the historical details of things. But there's, among the historians, there's a great debate as to when exactly different periods of history can be conveniently considered to begin and end and so forth, right? So when does the classical world end? When does the medieval world begin? And so forth. And a lot of people, rightly so, think of Augustine as both the last classical man and the first medieval man. So he's a bridge. And not only does he personally kind of embody that transition between classical Greco-Roman world into the medieval Christian world, but I'm convinced that his writings, especially The City of God and the Confessions, are intended to function as a bridge to carry people of his day, to carry pagan, Greco-Roman, classical citizens of Rome, to carry them over that bridge with him into embracing the new medieval Christian world. And so what I like to do is just kind of frame these works for you from that perspective. And we'll take really each one, briefly at a time here. So let's start with the city of God. All right, you have the city of God and you have confessions, and they each have a different kind of function that they play. And I would say in general that the city of God has a kind of political agenda, a political, theological, religious agenda, which are very closely intertwined in a way. In our world, we tend not to see those as intertwined. And then the Confessions has much more of a personal agenda. So Augustine wants to talk about the world at large. He wants to talk about Rome. And to talk about Rome means to talk about Rome's political influence, but also it's to talk about Rome's religion. So there's no real separation of church and state back then like we would consider. So as we'll see as I get further into this here, there's a sense in which art and politics and philosophy all are a kind of expression of religion. So if you want to understand, like today we think of an artist who would write, they maybe paint something, or a sculptor, and their purpose would just be to create art. And so it's art for art's sake. Maybe it's for the sake of something beautiful or whatever. But if you go back to the classical world, really art is going to be an expression of religion most of the time. And it's also going to have a kind of political agenda. So religion, politics, art, all those things are very closely intertwined in a world in which they don't really separate these things. So to be a good Roman would imply that you would believe in the Roman gods, and that you would honor them and so forth, which is why Christians tended to get in trouble, because their Christian beliefs were perceived as being anti-patriotic, and maybe even politically subversive, and that's just that's not gonna be tolerated back then. So again, the city of God, civitate Dei in the Latin, is this large-scale analysis of Rome and Roman culture and Roman religion, and then in the Confessions, it's going to be much more of this personal, intimate journey that Augustine opens up himself and his story, his personal story, so that others then can enter into that story and then walk with him out of the pagan Roman experience into the Christian experience. Okay, so let's go back here then, one at a time. That's kind of the big picture, and then now we can go back and nail both of these. So we need to understand here what precipitates the writing of the City of God by Augustine. And in the early 400s, Rome falls for the first time in centuries. And this is relatively shortly after the Christian religion was recognized, like Constantine, Theodosius, and others. And so the claim was among Roman citizens, the scuttlebutt or the critique was that there's a direct connection between Rome's pagan past and its worship of its gods with its growth in power from a small village of shepherds, huts, these little, this little tiny shepherd village. And over hundreds and hundreds of years under the worship of the pagan gods, this little village grows into a world superpower. And then, lo and behold, when those gods are given up and when the new religion, Christianity, is embraced, it's not long for the city to fall for the first time in centuries and centuries and centuries. And so the claim, it seemed to them, is pretty obvious. There must be a connection here. And the Christian religion it's bad. It's bad politically, culturally. It's making us weak. It's made us vulnerable. And so therefore, you need to go back to the pagan gods and worship them and give up on the Christian faith. So from that perspective, Augustine has to come in. And he starts out really by playing defense. But in the process of playing defense, his work, The City of God, basically becomes a devastating critique of pagan religion. And so you can think of that work as a really important part of that bridge process. You need, on a macro scale, to be able to say the pagan world is something that's not to be embraced. It's not to be embraced socially. It's not to be embraced politically. And here are the reasons for that. And he does a lot of stuff in the City of God, but that's the main thing that comes about, right? So in the process of defending the Christian faith against this slander that they're the cause of the fall of Rome, he ends up really going hard after the Roman Empire, the Roman people, the Roman morals, and most importantly, then the Roman gods. And so this is where he does some serious slicing and dicing, and that helps to function as this bridge where you go, okay, I get it, Augustine, I get it. This pagan religion is really bad, and I should really embrace this new Christian religion. Okay, so the question then is how does he do this? And with all these things, your great thinkers really do think in kind of extraordinary, extensive ways. So what do I mean by that? Well, we tend not to consider this or believe this, but it's really a fact that when you buy into a certain idea, that you don't have the luxury of just buying into that one idea. That necessarily to buy into one idea makes you, if you're going to be consistent philosophically, it's going to make you buy into a lot of ideas. And your great thinkers think in terms of vast, like, world perspectives. And they realize that if I'm going to buy into this particular point, then if I'm going to be consistent, I'm going to have to buy into all, X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E. So, Augustine in the process here really puts his finger on the central, you could say the central belief or value of the Roman people, and especially even the Greco-Roman world. And he's going to see that value is actually diametrically opposed to the fundamental Christian value. And so he's going to say this, that if you really dig down deep into the Roman perspective of things, you're going to see that human pride is at the center of it all. And that the Roman Empire is basically a fleshing out of this restless attempt and desire on people's part to create something that makes them proud of themselves and then celebrates that greatness in their own pride. And he sees, he basically is able to dissect that culture and see it from that perspective. So, and then he says, essentially, the Christian religion replaces that with humility. And whereas the pagan understanding, and it's not just the Roman, but he calls it the city of man. essentially says that all non-Christian societies have this fundamental quality, is that it's really about exalting human beings and pride in human beings. And so Rome is just kind of the latest iteration, latest version, like Pride 5.0 or whatever you want to call it. So, and they're actually, maybe the biggest, baddest, best at doing this. But at the end of the day, it's pride and therefore self-sufficiency and this restless need to take on others and conquer. And it's just this restlessness. And then he says, well, that's the city of man, but Christianity really is the city of God. And what it does is, whereas the city of man is really about exalting man, even at the expense of God, exalting yourself at the expense of others, Christianity really sees that the fundamental need of human beings is to depend on their creator, and then in humility to acknowledge that dependence as reality, and then rather than being restless in their efforts to substantiate their greatness, to find that God is their place of rest. So a very famous line that we'll get to a little later here from the Confessions is that our hearts are restless as human beings until we find our rest in God. So this is the contrast that he makes. And so this begins his critique and basically says, look at, you want to talk about virtue all you want, but basically Rome is, it's basically a great, powerful, clobbering machine that's there to exalt human beings at the expense of so many things. So there's that moral critique, and he's going to address that then in the Confessions in a second here. But the other thing that I really wanted to focus on, which is really fascinating, especially in terms of classical education and reading various books, but Augustine's famous for referring to a man named Varro, Varro, which you might be familiar with in your Latin studies, but he's considered by Augustine and others to be the authority on pagan religion. And in book 6 of The City of God, Augustine recounts the very famous claim by Varro that pagan religion is actually a very, very sophisticated thing. I think this is very interesting for us to take note of, because it's very easy for us to commit what C.S. Lewis has famously called chronological snobbery. And the idea is that just by virtue of us being born in the 21st century or 20th century, that somehow gives us like an advantage in terms of insight and wisdom. And those poor Slavs back in the 400 BC or whatever, they're just such primitive people, because they just they don't have iPhones and Call of Duty or whatever, and it's easy for us to think that maybe the pre-modern world is just full of really stupid superstition, and that Greek and Roman religion is pretty naive. But the Varro says this about pagan religion, and he says this, especially the Roman religion, and then he says really it's like a threefold. There's 3 dimensions to it. And he says, it's like there are 3 religions coexisting simultaneously. And he says there is, like we could think about this like in terms of the Aeneid, which is clearly one of the most important books that you need to read. But the question is, what is the status of those gods in the Aeneid? Or go back to the Odyssey, or you go back to the Iliad. What is, you could say, the truth status of those gods? So when Virgil is writing his Aeneid, does he believe those gods exist or not? And if he does believe they exist, in what sense do they exist? And Warrow says, don't be fooled. There is a religion of the philosophers, which is really monotheistic. And there's a religion of the poets, which is polytheistic. And then there's a religion of like the priests and those in power politically, and it's a civic religion. And so these great works like Virgil's Aeneid, the gods in there actually stand for different things. And you could say that they exist in some really important ways, but not in others. So if we just kind of tease this out, because this leads into, this is basically, in a weird way, Augustine's way to discredit these pagan gods. So what does this mean that it's the god of the poets? Well, you could say that the gods in the Aeneid are actually just poetic fictions. There is no Mr. Zeus running around in the heavens doing his thing. And Juno isn't a person, you know, they're not having a powwow together as people, as like those kind of beings. Right? They're fictions. They're great. They're literature. They're intended to delight, and you can enjoy them at that level as story. And so that's, you could say, one level of pagan religion is really what we would say is artistic, right? It's literary, it's artistic. And the common person who's not part of the elite would actually believe that Jupiter's Jupiter, Juno's Juno, and they're people, and they talk to each other, and they throw thunderbolts, and they throw temper tantrums and all that. But if you're part of the intellectual elite, you would know that that's not true. That that's a kind of a very naive conception, and you know it. You know that that's not. It's fiction. It's poetry. And then you would also have a political dimension to it, and that is just like I was saying earlier. Whereas we have a separation of church and state, they don't separate church and state in the ancient world. So church is state. So what does it mean to be a good religious individual in Rome? Would be to be a patriotic citizen who obeys the laws and can be relied on to serve the country and sacrifice the country. So it's very closely knit. So on the one hand, the gods of the poets are literary and fiction, but in another sense, they play a really, really important role in shaping the citizens so that they become a good citizen. So there's this political agenda behind them. And so Zeus is there to promote your love of country and to promote your commitment to justice and so forth. And so again, the average person would see that. And then also the elite would understand, yeah, it's true. This is the best way to think about these things because it helps us all have a stable society. So they would believe in the gods in that sense, that they are politically relevant and they're helpful for keeping society in order. And then the third would be the philosophers. And they would look at something like Zeus and Juno, or Jupiter and Juno, the various gods, and they basically would see them as stand-ins for certain like permanent, non-negotiable aspects of the world. So, you know, later on, Augustine in the Confessions is going to really wrestle with the need to see God as transcendent. And this is not pagan at all. The pagan understanding is that the gods are a part of the universe. They're aspects of the universe. And so you can see that this is very compatible with philosophers seeing the gods as having a deeper meaning to them that makes them really true. So you could say that Zeus is a kind of way of thinking about fate. And the Greco-Roman world views the world as ultimately governed by fate, well, then you can think about what that would mean philosophically. You can get insights into what the world would be like because of that, by meditating on these various stories like the Aeneid, right? So again, this is really sophisticated stuff. These aren't a bunch of backwards, superstitious ignoramuses. These are very, very sophisticated people whose view of religion is actually very rich. Now, from a Christian perspective, we would disagree with this and have all kinds of concerns about the manipulation of citizens through stories that are, false about the gods or God and so forth. So, but this is what's going on. And so when Augustine writes this book, he basically blows the whistle so that anybody who can read can now understand pagan religion for what it is. It's highly sophisticated. It's also philosophically interesting, but it's fiction. These gods aren't real. They're not real as persons. They're real in terms of kind of abstract principles of the world, but they're not persons. And so this is how you can see if Augustine is trying to reach his generation, his age. This helps them say, okay, I get it. Christianity is a completely different kind of thing. It's completely different. It's based in history. It's based in claims of transcendence. It's not fiction. It's not playing games with you politically, and it's not like an abstract way of philosophizing about different aspects of the world as we know it. So, okay, so let's see here. How are we in time? I think I have a few more minutes here. I didn't know I would spend that much time on the City of God, but I just put these notes together, and I've never given this lecture before. So let me try to do my best to move a little more quickly. And that way I think we can finish up here in about 5 minutes or so. I'm going to blitz through the Confessions. The Confessions is a weird book. Not only is it a weird book, but it's also shockingly frank. Augustine is very, very honest and open. This is very different from classical literature. But basically, he wants to take us, instead of analyzing the world at large in Rome and how problematic it is and its religion is problematic, he just wants you to walk with him through his personal journey. And so the first 9 books is something like autobiography, and it's cradle to his conversion, books 1 to 9. So it traces his years growing up. He's an infant, young kid, going to school, adolescent, and then he kind of launches his career. And in the process, this is his journey. This is his journey to the Christian faith. And book 9 actually has a kind of mystical vision that culminates that part of the Confessions. Now, I do say it's a weird book because if you only read books 1 to 9, you think it's an autobiography, and it's a deeply religious, spiritual autobiography. But what makes it weird is then you have books 10 to 13. And again, from a classical perspective, these are books because they were the size of a scroll, right? So the Confessions would take up 13 scrolls. So books 10 to 13 are not autobiographical, and they're strange, and you're not sure exactly how these things fit. Book 10, he has an entire philosophic kind of musing / analysis about memory. And you're like, why memory? And then the next book is this philosophic analysis, one of the best philosophic analysis of time. So you get this autobiography to conversion, and then you get a book on memory, like what is memory? And then like time. He's very famous for saying, what then is time? And he sees all these crazy puzzles with time. It's very difficult to figure out what time is, how it works, so forth. It's very, even today, it's considered very high level philosophic analysis of time. So you get those 2 books, and then you have the next book, 12, on Genesis 1 of the Bible. And it's this whole series of questions about Genesis 1. And then if that's not enough, then he adds another book, book 13, and it's a whole different discussion on Genesis 1. And so you're looking at all this going, okay, whatever, Confessions, you're interesting, but I don't know what's going on here. If you want to be an autobiography, fine. If you want to like obscure philosophy, memory and time, that's fine. If you want to just go theology on us and talk about Genesis 1, okay, that's fine. But what's the unity here? So what I'm going to say is this. There are two major things going on that I like to focus on, and they all culminate in, and all make sense of those last four books, okay? And this is it. This is a personal journey, but it's a personal journey that is looking at essentially the inadequacies of the pagan worldview. And the one part of that journey is intellectual. And so what happens is as you go through Augustine's life, you get to watch him he basically tries out and tries to think his way through various available philosophies that are there in the pagan world. And what happens is he goes through those, he's a Manichaean for a while, and he really kind of gets turned on by Neoplatonism. But ultimately, all this stuff philosophically takes him to finally conclude that Christianity is the truth philosophically. And so he takes you through that journey, and that's really important, right? Personally, if you're going to walk with him from the pagan world into the Christian world, then you need to have answers. You need to say, well, what answers make sense of the world as I know it in the best possible way? And what are my alternatives? So he thinks those through with you and invites you to come think those through. And that takes you intellectually out of the classical world into the Christian world. And then the other is simultaneously occurring, but it's really his personal journal morally. So the weakness of the pagan world is twofold. One, its philosophical answers are insufficient. And Christianity has a more coherent, powerful, explanatory power philosophically. But the other problem is that the fundamental claim of the pagan world in its highest, you'd say highest form, which would be like philosophy and Socrates, is that it really can't deliver you out of the power of sins. So the Socratic idea real quick is that, boy, you just need information, and knowledge leads to self-mastery. And so the key is you just got to know. And Augustine just basically shows, actually, we're broken, and it's really even a kind of mystery inside of us as to why we'd like all this brokenness, like what's going on inside of us. And so he wrestles with that. You get the famous stealing of the pear story when he's an adolescent. He goes out with his high school buddies and they're like, hey, we're bored, let's go steal pears. We don't need them anyways, but let's steal it just because we can. And so he puzzles about that, like what's going on inside of us that we want to do evil when there's no good to be had from it. So that moral struggle then leads him to finally realize that intellectual ability combined with pride in that intellectual, like brain power, doesn't get your life figured out. It doesn't release you from, like we would say, something like addictions or sinful desires. It doesn't leave you in control of yourself. And so, like I said before, whereas the city of man is rooted in pride, now if we look into the soul, you can see that pride initially drives the philosophic quest, and then also this desire for self-control. And when you realize that this intellectual power can't give you self-control, then you realize actually that you need to call out on God, and then you find dependence there. And that means you got to humble yourself, And if you humble yourself and acknowledge that dependence, then you can finally put your restless heart to rest in God. Okay, so real quick then, I think we can finish up here. We're right at the 40-minute mark or so. Books 10 to 13 then, why do you have this thing on memory? Why do you just have this thing on time? What are these two commentaries on Genesis? And basically what it is if you walk across this bridge with Augustine, then you're going to have to orient yourself completely differently in terms of where you're going to get your truth from. And essentially, if the universe isn't divine, like it doesn't have a Zeus aspect to it or a Jupiter or a Juno aspect to it, then you can't find God by looking out into the world. The only way you're going to find him is inside your soul. And he's going to target your memory. It's weird, but he's going to say that that's where you actually intersect with God. So that makes sense then why you'd want a book on memory. But you got to figure out memory because that's where you're going to find God. And then time is really important because if the world's created, according to Genesis 1, then the world's not timeless, eternal, like the pagans thought. Then you have to think about the implications of the relationship of the divine order, which is transcendent, with this created order, which is time bound. So you got to think about time. And then if your new authority is not going to be reason, but it's going to be the Bible, then you're going to have to figure out the importance of the Bible. And two things you need to know about the Bible. How do you read it? And that's book 12. How do you read Genesis 1? And then 2, what does it teach you about like the structure of the universe? And so book 13 looks at Genesis in kind of that metaphysical sense. All right. Whew, we're done. I hope so. I think we did it.
Yes, certainly. Thank you so much. So one question that I have is for those of our students and webinar attendees who maybe haven't read anything by St. Augustine, where's a good place to start? It can be a little daunting to look at the City of God. I know I was assigned it in undergrad, thankfully only portions, but that book, it's big. So where should one start?
Yeah, great question. So probably the Confessions. I know like with our honors program here, our incoming freshmen, they have a lot to work through because we're going all through West Civ together, but we do read portions of the Confessions. So I would say, well, what we have them read is books 1 and 2, and those are the early years of Augustine, especially book 2 when he, goes out with his high school buddies and steals the pears. It's a very famous passage, and it wrestles with this idea of evil and how does, what is evil and why do you do stuff that you don't want to do and why it's worthless. Those 2 books are really important. We also have them read book 8, where he has his famous conversion scene. So he's wrestling with the fact that he can't find self-control. And then he's sitting in a garden and he hears a child say, "Tolelegge, pick up and read, pick up and read." And so he just says, wow, maybe that's a sign. So he goes over and picks up the book of the Bible and reads chapter 13 in the book of Romans. And it gives him kind of this insight. And then he finds that he can finally give his life to God. So that's a really important book, book 8. It's probably, you really want to kind of wade into the last 4 books, I would probably say stick with book 10 on memory. That's basically an exploration. It's pretty psychological. And I think it's actually interesting. It's more accessible. This one on time is, hey, if you like that stuff, great. I like it. But it's basically a kind of combination of philosophy and stream of consciousness. So he'll ask these questions and then he'll say, well, what about this? And he goes back and forth and back and forth. So you have to have a certain amount of patience to know that he's trying to tease out more solid answers from others. But I would say those would be a good place to start. In terms of the City of God is, as you said, it's huge. It's huge. I would say probably what would be the most beneficial would be book 19. book 19. And there he really talks about different ways of life that would be, that Christians can participate in. Can they be philosophers? Can they go into public service? Because those are the big those are the options for pagans. He says, yeah, it's fine. He talks about the two cities in terms of kind of the basic principles of politics. So that's a useful place to start, manageable place to start for the city of God.
Another question I have, so for us who are reading St. Augustine through a sort of modern or postmodern lens, what are some common misconceptions we can have when reading him, and how do we get around that?
Great. I think one of the biggest challenges for the Confessions in particular is it's easy because he's so introspective, and he's really hard on himself. Like, he doesn't pull any punches, and he's actually found out to be true. This is really interesting. I don't know if probably some people in our audience here are familiar with Jordan Peterson. He's kind of a rock star as of late here. He's not a Christian guy, but he was interviewing one of these psychologists. And Augustine is like notorious for saying that infants actually are pretty violent, and that they're sinful. And when you read it, you're just like, ooh, picking on these little babies. How can you do that? That's not nice. That's not fair. Why can't you just...
You've had little siblings or babysat, you know that is often the case, isn't it?
Well, so Peterson is interviewing this guy who's made an entire career about analyzing this. And when he carefully defines violence and so forth, little babies, infants, they can't hurt anybody. So, but if you look at their desire to harm, the most violent time in a person's life by far is when they're 2-year-old. And so poor Augustine, who gets beat up, if they bite you or they hit you or whatever, and it's just, and what happens is, as you mature as a human being, you're able to substitute language to manage conflict, right? But when you're 2 years old, you don't understand what's going on, and you just fight. So anyways, I don't know why I brought that up, but so it's easy to really be hard on Augustine, and that he's just some depressed dude, and too introspective. But
most certainly my impression when I read the Confessions freshman year. I was not a fan of it, to say the least, and I still have to go back and reread it. I think with a certain amount of maturity, I hopefully will appreciate it more. But that's a warning from me to all of you students. Don't hate St. Augustine or think that he's having a pity party, because that's what I thought.
Yeah, and he's not. The more you read him, the more carefully you read him, the more you see that he's unusually really even-handed. So, and we're not. We just give ourselves the benefit of the doubt all the time, and think that when we're do something that is hurtful to people, that we have our reasons or whatever. But he's actually pretty insightful. Although I've been told this, you probably should start reading Augustine after you have a midlife crisis, and then you're ready to read him. So hopefully our audience, they have plenty of time ahead of them for
Yes. Mini crises maybe as they're looking at college, but hopefully not too big. Well, do we have any questions from any of our attendees? Feel free to drop them in the question and answers. If not, I can keep coming up with some. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very thought-provoking. But you did use two terms that some of our audience members might not be familiar with. So you said that Augustine went to Manichaeism as a religion, and then also to Neoplatonism. So could you give us like a elevator pitch, I guess, on what both of those mean?
Yep, can do. So Manichaeism is a weird hybrid religion that was popular at its time. It's a mixture of some aspects of Christianity and Zoroastrianism, and so and the important thing to remember, though, is that it's a kind of dualism. So what does that mean? Well, if you hold a Christian religion, Christian beliefs, then you know that the supreme being that exists is God, and he has no challengers and he has no equal. And Manichaeans believe that there were two ultimately superior beings, one which causes good and which causes evil. And so life is this continual battle between good and evil. And this gets manifested in your personal life in terms of, insofar as you're embodied, you're evil. And insofar as you're intellectual, then you're good. And so your whole life is basically to completely eliminate any kind of bodily aspects of your life as much as possible and to be as intellectual as possible. Neoplatonism, it's Platonism, meaning that Plato believed that the all of existence as we know it can be divided in two. There is the visible realm and there's the intelligible realm. And ultimately, what gives order and meaning, intelligibility to the material visible world are these, what he calls forms. And it's kind of like the idea of blueprints. And these blueprints, so you could say, the example he gives is you could have a carpenter, and a carpenter can make all kinds of tables in the visible world. But in order to make that table, he would have to have the idea of a table. And that idea is then, another word for that would be the form. And ultimate reality is the intelligible world, not the visible world. And then the ultimate form is the good. So, and Neoplatonism basically says that through intellectual endeavor, that you can think your way out of the visible world into the world of the forms and have a kind of mystical experience of the highest form, which is the divine, which is the good. So that's pretty good.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like we have a question. So Hope asks, you mentioned the difference between the perspectives on separation of church and state. Obviously, postmodern life claims to do so separate church and state, but are humans really capable of this? Is it covert now and perhaps overt during St. Augustine's time? So that's a fantastic question.
Yeah. Yes, right. So let's see, in 3 seconds, let me see if I can answer that rich question. It all depends what you mean by separate, right? So you can think of that at a political level, you can think of it at an intellectual level, like a philosophical level. So you could say that every religion has a kind of implicit political understanding in it, right? So you say, if you believe in many gods, then you can tease out certain political implication of that. Or if you believe in the Christian God, then that's going to say your politics is going to reflect that. So if you're saying, can you kind of intellectually put these things in cubby holes so that they don't have an implication for each other, then I think the answer would be no, right? So you can't separate church and state in terms of conceptually. But you can do it, you want to talk about it institutionally. So you could say, think of the US Constitution. So the US Constitution does not require any kind of a religious affiliation for you to run for office. So does that mean that, so in that sense, you could say that in order for our political order to work best, we think that it's important that your religious beliefs do not become a litmus test for public service, right? So, but then you could flip that around and say, okay, but if you're gonna be a Christian and you're gonna run for office, can you really separate those two? Right? And you would say, no, I would live out my life as a Christian in a certain way, and I'm in office. So again, it's a great question. I have a very strong separation of church and state background. I think it's really healthy for churches not to wield political authority over other people. I think it's really good for those, for churches, denominations, and I also think it's healthy for government to limit its interest in shaping religion and using it for its own purposes, because governments need religious people, and they can often co-opt the purpose of a church for their own ends. So great question, but I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of the complexity of things.
It's a really involved issue. You probably teach an entire semester's worth of classes on that one question, couldn't you? So fantastic question. Well, I think we are just about out of time. So if there are any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. If not, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Shumaker, for giving us such a wonderful presentation. And people who've joined us, let me just continue to encourage you to take a look at our author bank for the CLT. We will have more presentations, this journey through the author bank going forward. So if you've liked this one, join us in a couple of weeks. And then on our YouTube channel, if you are interested in watching some previous ones. So we have had lectures on C.S. Lewis, Aeschylus, any of these members of our author bank who you're interested in, go ahead and give that a view as well. So thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great Thursday and enjoy your weekend. Thank you.